opinion on Sky News Australia starts now. This is Outsiders.
Good morning and welcome to Outsiders, the show that is to woke virtue signalling and identity politics on steroids. What this particular US military spokesperson is to striking fear into the hearts of the military leaders of Russia, China, Iran and North Korea.
All too often, I hear leaders talk about providing everyone with dignity and respect like it's an aspirational goal. That's not good enough. Dignity and respect is the bare minimum. It's the floor of where we can be. We must set our sights higher and focus on intentional inclusivity because there are still far too many people out there, not just LGBTQ individuals, that feel marginalized, shut out, or discriminated against.
Oh, yes, you can just imagine China watching that. The West's enemies tend to be slightly more fearful of, you know, classic military tough-talking and macho bravoism.
Bravissimo!
Bravissimo!
Here we go.
So for all of you out there, I ask you to set out your symbols of pride, share your pronouns in your email, particularly if you're a person who doesn't think they need to.
Ah, yes, well, share those pronouns. That'll show the Ruskies. But can someone remind me what the most common Russian and Chinese pronouns are?
Initiate difficult conversations about racial and gender barriers and share a bit of your vulnerability in a way that draws others in.
Wow.
Well, I'm really not sure that showing your vulnerabilities to draw others in is a brilliant military strategy. We might ask Richard Kemp about that later in the show, but let's hope we never find out. In the meantime, let's grab the latest Outsiders news.
Instead of Bravissimo, he was talking about setting up a honey trap. Maybe we're not thinking this through. You're drawing people in with your honey trap.
I don't know what
They divulge their secrets.
Yeah.
And
somehow when I think honey trap, I don't think of that character who is just up there on the screen.
all right.
Well, speaking of it,
reaching.
apparently there's a spy in the Australian politics somewhere to do with the... We'll be talking about that later in the show. We certainly will. But let's talk now about the There was a by-election last night that the Libs came, nearly won at one point there. It looked like they could win. Then they didn't. There was a swing, but it wasn't a big enough swing, etc., etc. Let me just say this. I personally am thrilled with last night's result. Why? Because had Labor lost, they'd have gone into a tailspin. Somehow or other, they would have managed to get rid of Albo and they might have put someone electable into the role running up to the next election. But now what we have, thanks to yesterday, we're going to have the Albo Clown Show is going to carry on. They're going to be booking more Taylor Swift concerts. They're going to be rushing around. They're going to be living the high life, off to the tennis, doing all this. And the poor people of Australia will suffer and watch this clown show carry on. So I reckon it's a result that will lead to Peter Dutton being the next Prime Minister. What do you reckon, Rita?
Well, you heard it here first. We said here last week, Labor were the hot favourite to retain that seat. It was likely going to become a marginal seat, and that is precisely what's happened. If they have a swing like that throughout a number of seats, they're going to be in a bit of trouble. So it's all a question of whether this swing will be reflected elsewhere. I'm not shocked by this. This is what we expected to happen. It's a strange seat, Dunkley. It's actually a seat that the Libs should hold every day of the week. And it says a great deal about how lost they have been recently that it's still a Labor seat, because this is a seat full of aspirational people who aren't mainly wealthy, but they want a better future for their kids. They work hard and their values are not aligned with Labor anymore. And I'm talking about those critical social issues, you might say, the cultural issues, and the Liberals have just been absent in those fights for too long. So a seat like Dunkley and those outer suburbs the rural areas is where the Liberals' future is. If they actually want to be in, they've got to forget about the teal seats.
Yep.
You might pick them up every now and then, you might lose them, but you can't be preoccupied with re-winning those teal seats and ignoring what the people in places like Dunkley care about, because that's your future.
And yet, just to sound a cautionary note on this, yes, it's absolutely true that seats almost never flip in the middle of the first term at a by-election.
I think it's been 90 years or something.
Yeah, it's been decades and decades. It's been a long, long time. The swing didn't come in as big as thought. Now, the interesting thing about Dunkley, though, is that it's really quite an economically diverse seat. It's got some very posh booths, some rather tealy booths even, and it's got more sort of working class and aspirational ones. Now, what's interesting here is that the Dutton strategy of going after these outer suburban seats sort of vindicated, but they did better than they thought at the teal-type booths, the ones with a higher sort of economic income. The interesting thing about this tells me a couple of things. Number one, they shouldn't completely give up on those teal seats. All right?
I agree with that, 100%.
And I'm saying that's still the heartland, but never give those up because you need those back to get government. Number two, you listen to some of the Voxies last night, speaking to people on the street. People were saying, it's a cost of living stuff, and then they were saying they were going to vote for Albo and they were going to vote for Labour. And part of that, I think, is that because Albo has the ability to basically bribe people with the stage 3 tax cut changes, that cut through, and there's no doubt about that. And I think that if that by-election hadn't occurred, the stage 3 debate might be very different right now. The message, though, for Peter Dutton has to be one where they say, look, Albo is telling you lies. He's gaslighting you when he says things are getting better, that your income is going up. It's not. Prices are still too high. You're not getting your $275 utility bill cut. Your household income went backwards more last year in Australia than in any OECD country. So we are shifting backwards. We are going backwards. It's lifestyle shrinkflation, and that's the problem that Australia has. That's the message that Peter Dutton is going to have to hit a lot harder.
I think Labor's going to be too smart to do that. I don't think they're going to come and tell people we're doing so much better.
But they
Look
are.
at this economic data when they know people are hurting. They know people who've got a mortgage have had more than 10 increases. So they really are counting on some interest rate cuts to come before the next election to alleviate some of that cost of living, and hopefully they'll be thinking we'll get credit for that because people will feel that in their hip pocket. But I'm not saying abandon the teal seats. I'm saying if you form policies and your agenda through the filter of through the lens of those,
that's correct.
Then you are never going to make a meaningful impact in those outer seats in the regional areas.
And in fact, in a second, we'll be looking again at how the Teals have betrayed the Jews of Australia. Appalling letter written by all the Teals who pretend that they're not a political party. They are. They all signed a letter to Penny Wong urging aid to be sent, refunding of UNRWA. This is the mob that we've talked about here, and the Teals are there begging for more funding for UNRWA to be restored. Well, that is essentially an absolute anathema to any Jewish person in this country, quite rightly, and the Teals will probably get rid of the seats themselves with any luck, James.
Well,
seriously, the way they're carrying on.
Like in the seat of Goldstein, for example, the candidate there who won the seat at the last federal election, her record on this issue was pretty clear. She had signed some fairly questionable open letters already, well before the October 7 terror attack. And yet there were many Jews in that seat who voted for her. I know that because I spoke to a number of Jewish locals who were handing out how to vote cards, and they said they were so disgusted by the number of people voting for somebody who they considered to be anti-Israel. So at some point, there needs to be an awakening to what you're backing. If you're backing policies that are detrimental to your community, detrimental to your interests, then what can we say?
Absolutely. Well, even Allegra Spender signed up to that disgraceful letter. We'll talk about that a bit later. But let's bring in now Bridget McKenzie from the Nationals. Senator McKenzie, great to see you as always. Let's get your take on, was this... this is obviously a loss for the Libs last night, but there was a swing towards the Liberal Party. So how did you read it? What's your take out?
Yeah, I think your analysis, both James and Rita, are very, very on point. I spent a bit of time in Dunkley. It is a unique seat, but it really is that aspirational, low to middle income community that just wants to get ahead, loves its country, loves its family, and they work really hard. And Albanese isn't actually delivering for them on a raft of fronts, and I think they need to understand more and more that that is the actual fact. But it was a really strong result yesterday for Peter Dutton and Nathan Conroy, I thought. If you think about within 2 years, we've basically flipped nearly 10% if you compare it to the Aston by-election. And that is because the trend of the Australian voters in these types of seats is that they don't see the Labor Party as being on their side, whether it's inflation, cost of living, energy policy, or indeed, you know, the big new car tax that's coming their way.
Yeah.
So I think it was a really positive, you know, taking it from a safe Labor seat and within 18 months making it a marginal seat is quite historic. You know, the average swing for a first-term government is 1.7%. So we're really pleased with the result, and it's a great foundation to head into the general election next year.
Bridget, tell us, though, does the Liberal Party, you know, you talk about this as an aspirational seat, but the Labor government under Albanese has really attacked small business aspiration through regulation, through IR law changes, all of these sorts of things, a tax code that punishes the accumulation of capital and wealth. Does the coalition need to do more to not just rely on discontent, but also to become, again, much more explicitly the coalition, the party of aspiration, and making that, you know, a really positive thing that people can get behind and want to get on board with?
Yeah, James, I think you're dead right. I think what you've seen under Peter Dutton and David Littleproud in terms of the leadership of the coalition is a back-to-basics approach. And I think that's working. Australians are doing it tough, and they need to see, have the government's failures obviously exposed, which is part of our job. But the other part of our job is to have some really practical, tangible ways that we're going to assist with that. And getting back to basics, I think, as a centre-right political movement is our first step. And so we've been making those sorts of decisions. You've seen us come out on the family car tax very, very strongly, and a raft of other measures on calling out Labor's failure to get their spending under control and the flow and impact that has on keeping inflation high and therefore interest rates. But we need to have that conversation louder, more strongly, more consistently, and at a grassroots level in communities around the country.
Rita.
I wonder, Bridget, if there should have been more made about the cultural issues during this election. You had a candidate there from Labor who essentially called the majority of her electorate as suffering from the worst example
of just incredible
white privilege. 56% voted no in the referendum, and she said to her that was a worst example of white privilege, and she railed against that. Now, I didn't hear much from the Liberals. It was something like you don't want to veer into that direction. But I think people care about these cultural issues. These are substantive issues. They're not things... I don't know, sometimes I feel like the Liberals treat them like trivial afterthoughts, not worthy of a debate.
Point, Bridget.
No. Yeah, no, they define. I think the cultural issues actually define our societies, and the Dunkley community were very, very significantly no. And I mentioned at every interview I did about Dunkley, about the white privilege comment, because let's think about this community being represented by a very popular community member in Peter Murphy, who, you know, died in tragic circumstances. They now have a local MP who thinks they're all elitists. Now, let's get that local MP meeting as many of her constituents as possible over the next 18 months so they can actually see that she's no Peter Murphy. And in fact, has
Bridget,
a level of derision.
I'm going to jump in there, Bridget.
A level of derision to her community.
No, she's an extremely charismatic individual, and I want to play you a clip which shows her personality, her charisma, the impact, the dynamic impact she is going to have on the Australian Parliament. And watch even Albo shudder in the corner as she's speaking. Take it away, new member for Dunkley.
Rowan.
Peta was a strong, wise and confident woman that represented our community. She delivered for Dunkley, and I ask the people of Dunkley to vote for me because I too will deliver for Dunkley. I will be a strong, local, confident representative for the people of this great community.
Little shudder there from Albo. You know, I'm not sure she's exactly going to set the place on fire. Maybe I'm being unfair, Bridget. But tell us what you think, seriously, what you think that she will bring to the Parliament that, you know, Albo and the Labor Party can go, thank God we got her over the line.
Well, I've been focused on Nathan Conroy, and what I think the people of Dunkley wanted was their Frankster Baxter rail upgrade, for instance. That's the type of thing they want delivered. The Labor Party really didn't put on the table any great promises in this campaign to be delivered. In fact, they've restricted funding to the 2 local councils within Dunkley. They haven't had a major project being funded in the last 2 years. So she's got a big hill to climb if she's going to actually deliver for Dunkley before the next federal election. And I think Albo and his incompetent ministry will be not helping her fulfil that promise she just made on that clip.
James.
But now let's sort of throw things a bit forward here. We've got a budget coming up here. You're expecting, I would expect, there's going to be an awful lot of money thrown around. There's going to be very little in the way of spending restraint in terms of what's coming down the road. This is all going to be setting up, obviously, for an election probably next year, but possibly later this year. How concerned and what is the coalition going to be doing to counter this sort of wave of money and saying, oh, well, we're going to make this cheaper and that cheaper by taking it out of this pocket and putting it into that pocket and clipping the ticket along the way?
Well, it's a really good question, James, and I think Australians need to be cognizant that the excessive spending by this government, I think it's, in excess of, $200 billion additional spending over the forward since they've come to power, is actually making getting inflation under control harder. And you see that in the figures. And Michelle Bullock is not going to put downward pressure on the interest rates, which is the thing that's really killing the suburbs out there, until she can see some restraint from these guys, let alone the productivity drag. So every decision they're making is making getting inflation and therefore interest rates harder. We need to unpack that very complicated relationship much more simply and clearly for the Australian public so that the fault of that high mortgages and the fault of high grocery prices and energy prices is sitting squarely at the feet of the Labor Party and not the Ukraine war, which they're still trotting out as one of, the reasons why Australians are struggling. I mean, get a grip. So that is our task. And I think those who are, the economists in our community, independent and otherwise, need to be really prosecuting that going forward because these guys aren't putting any discipline into their budget. They are going to go on a spending spree. And when you're a family that is struggling to pay the bills, struggling to keep a hold of your house, keep your kids in school, etc., any relief is going to be welcomed. And that's sort of the reality and the perverse, I think, tension that's going on. So that they're going to get that short-term relief, but it will keep the fundamental economic situation in place for longer, hurting more people for longer.
Now, Bridget, we had the news during the week from the head of ASIO that there was a character within one of the political parties, a politician who'd shall remain nameless, who'd been betraying this nation or dealing with foreign nations, and there was talk of family of a Prime Minister being involved and all sorts of things, all sorts of, spy drama, skullduggery. So what's your take? Who is the mystery spy, Bridget McKenzie?
Well, you'll have to, try a lot harder to get that.
Nothing like putting you on the spot.
But I do think, irrespective of which side of politics this person comes from, the name should be public because otherwise all former MPs are subject to suspicion. And I appreciate that, no charges can be laid because there's no ongoing investigation. But all of us need to be aware that foreign operatives exist, they target us, and we can't be naive to that.
Well, why can't there be charges? We're talking about treason here. If we're a serious country, there would be charges forthcoming. But you've got something none of us have access to, which is parliamentary privilege. If you find out the name, will you get up in Parliament and say, this is the traitor who was amongst us?
Yeah, well, I think it is beholden on Claire O'Neill as the Minister to absolutely use parliamentary privilege in a responsible way, with integrity, and name this person. They sought to betray our country. They do not deserve to be protected in any way by the political class. It's not Burgess's job. He's a man of high integrity, and in frustration in his, statement around intelligence matters, made this known, that this was a fact. It is then beholden on the government to name that person so that you can take the associated guilt off those not operating with foreign operatives, but also highlight how serious this is.
James?
But Bridget,
it's not trivial.
It's absolutely not trivial. It's really, really, really serious. It doesn't get much more serious than this. But this is the real problem. The fact that, when you and other people say that it will take the shade off of other people who are ex-parliamentarians or other parliamentarians. The fact that I think everybody in the media and political class has been over the last 72 hours playing this party game of, who could it be? And the fact that there are so many potential people that people are thinking about, does that indicate that we actually have a much bigger problem than just this one particular person, that this foreign influence, that there are so many people who are under that shade, suggests that we have a real serious problem.
Yep.
Well, that's why it's so important, James, that the name is released. And then it actually becomes clear. I just don't know what the government's got to hide on this. It's not a trivial matter, as we all recognise. There is no need to protect this person, because they weren't thinking of protecting any of us or our country or our future, so they don't deserve protection. I just don't know why the name won't be released and the speculation can end, and this person will have to then deal with the consequences of their own behaviour.
Well, maybe we should do charades. Sounds like 2 syllables, ends with, whatever, rhymes with. We could have a lot of fun. Bridget McKenzie, thanks so much for coming on Outsiders this morning, and we'll speak to you again soon. Thanks so much. Now, carrying on with, so I was just talking about the Teals. Let's talk about the Teals briefly. They pretend not to be a political party, as I said before, yet they have all signed, all of them, Allegra Spender, Zoe Daniels, Sophie, whatever her name is, all of them have all signed this thing urging funding to go back to UNRWA. We know for a fact that funding for UNRWA in all likelihood ends up going either towards educating people to be terrorists or actually terror events themselves. That's been the evidence that's been provided. Why on earth would the Teals, Rita, be pushing to have UNRWA being refunded by the Australian taxpayer is utterly beyond me, and it says what I've always said. Labor, the Greens, and now the Teals are no friends of the Jews in this country. Full stop. You can't argue with that assertion if you read this document and read those signatures on it.
Particularly the Teals. I mean, the Teals, they're a shade of green and they should be part of the Greens because they really are far more close to the Greens in their ideology than they are to Labor. Let alone the Liberals, and yet they painted themselves as some sort of quasi-liberal, small L liberal. They're nothing of the sort, James.
Well, exactly right. And, I think we need to be very clear. Yes, it's very much about the Jews and the State of Israel, but really this is about civilization, OK? This is about the West. This is about what us and our allies stand for. And the idea that in the midst of Israel trying to eliminate Hamas, which is as evil an organization as you can get, Hamas, which is absolutely, entirely, 100% responsible for the immiseration of the Palestinian people, the fact that They are talking about, oh, well, let's try and help them out and take pressure off of them via UNRWA, which we know is very closely tied, and many people who have been involved with that also have ties to Hamas. Hamas approves who gets hired by them. We've heard that on this program before. That is just simply saying we are saying they're more important than the cause of it. If they really cared about the Palestinian people, they would be signing a letter saying, we call on Sinwar to give himself up.
Exactly.
We call on Hamas to release the hostages. We call on this idiocy from Hamas to end and for the Palestinian people to be allowed to reconstruct their lives under a democratic government.
Let's put those signatures up on the screen, please. These people are not only unbelievably naive, unbelievably stupid, it's a severe betrayal of the entire Jewish population
Zoe
of
Daniels,
this. They're all here. Zoe Daniels.
Monique Ryan, member for Kooyong.
Read them out, Rita.
Allegra Spender, member for Wentworth. These are people you voted for, people. Zali Stegel, member for Warringah. Kate Cheney, member for Curtin. Kylie Tink, Sophie Scamps, and we've also got Andrew Wilkie there to token mail. He's always around.
And Helen Haynes.
And these people are calling for more money, Australian taxpayers' dollars, to go to UNRWA, who have direct connections with the atrocities of October 7th, the beheadings, the murders, the rapes, the violence. UNRWA has direct links via Hamas to those atrocities. It's been well established, and the Teals are demanding more money, Australian taxpayers' dollars, go back to them. It is an absolute disgrace and shame on anyone who votes for those people at all. That's my opinion. Now let's move on. Let's talk about something a little bit lighter. The dog handling. We must have our dogs be culturally sensitive in the army.
Sorry, what?
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 The ADF dog handlers. Here we go. So ADF have orders their war dog handlers to undergo cultural awareness training.
Oh,
Can you believe
God.
this, Rita? This is the Australian Army. We showed the American Army at the top of the show, James.
Well, I'll
Here's
tell
the
you what,
Australian
Rowan,
Army.
maybe you need to ask the attack dog its pronouns first.
Exactly.
Maybe
Wolf and wolf.
Maybe Lassie
Fido.
is really a he. I don't know. Yeah.
This is incredible. And you can read through the lines and know precisely what this is about when they talk about cultural sensitivity risks. And it is, they are weakening our country. The military is there to protect us. They're there to kill the enemy if need be. Not to be...
So they're training attack dogs in the army to be aware of racial or cultural or ethnic or cultural difference.
I mean, they're training the dogs is next.
No, I bet they're training the dogs as well. You wait for it. Sure, they're handling, how's the handler going to train the dog? Tell me that. But it's a disgrace. And this is the weakening of the Australian military. It's worse in the States and in Britain, but it's happening here as well. Now, Rita, tell us about our dear friend Dan Andrews. Since he's retired, we don't talk about Dan Andrews often enough. I'll mention him later in my editorial on COVID. But Rita, read us a little bit from the Herald Sun.
Well, this was an exclusive report in yesterday's Herald Sun. Michael Warner has this story that Daniel Andrews has now been ordered to hand over his personal telephone and credit card records, all in relation to that Blairgowrie car crash where a teenager was seriously injured. So he's been served with a Supreme Court subpoena. That happened outside his Mulgrave home last week. Now, whether he's got these records, because we're talking back to 2013, is another thing. But reading this report, he just realised just how twisted things are in Victoria. Can I read directly from this report?
Please do.
So the phone records will be relied upon as part of a damages actions launched by Ryan's lawyers, Ryan's being the young kid who was injured, to ascertain who Mr Andrews called in the aftermath of the near-fatal crash, including whether he spoke to his then Chief of Staff, current Victorian Police Assistant Commissioner, Brett Curran. So the fact that you've got a Premier's former Chief of Staff now serving right up there in the hierarchy of the Victoria Police Force. I don't know why people question these things. Mr Curran has declined to clarify if he did receive a phone call from Mr Andrews from the scene of the crash. Hopefully there'll be some clarity around that as we go forward. And you've got to remember that Dan Andrews and his wife, Catherine, was driving. They've always maintained that this teenager's bike T-boned their Ford Territory, their car, but the teenagers said no, their car was speeding and seemed to come out of nowhere. And when you look at the photographs that finally emerged after years, you can see that they seem to support Ryan's claims. There's extensive damage you can see there to the windscreen. So if his bike has T-boned their car from the side, why is the windscreen caved in? Why does he have the injuries he has? I'm not saying I believe one account over the other, but there certainly needs to be far greater clarity around what happened in the aftermath of this crash, not just what happened during the crash, but in the aftermath.
Absolutely indeed. After the break, Reader's Reality Check, and we've got Richard Kemp to chat to in a tick.
You're watching Outsiders with your hosts, Rowan Dean, James Morrow, and I'm Rita Panahi from the Rita Panahi Show. Yes, Monday to Thursdays, 11 p.m. And every night we spend some time checking in on lefties losing it. Sometimes the content is provided by celebrities like the crazy ladies of The View.
You know what Joe Biden could do since he is presently president? What? Whoa. He could throw every Republican in jail. Yeah. I mean, he could.
Sometimes he could.
Oh, that's what they're doing.
Sometimes the content is self-explanatory. Here's a young lefty lady emoting wildly about an imagined genocide.
That is what the trans genocide in this country, in this city, has brought me to. Imagine that!
Let's do it.
I've got enough content because, to be fair, unhinged emoting makes up a lot of lefties losing it.
My choice! 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 My choice!
What is his choice? Was it his or her choice?
No, I think it's a her, and I think she's saying that it's her choice. I don't know if you got that message,
It
but
is her choice.
But sometimes lefties losing it is truly disturbing. Like these scenes recorded late last week at Deer Creek School District in Oklahoma, where students were licking the toes of other students during what the school calls its wonderful week of fundraising. According to the school, students volunteered to participate in different class competitions to raise money for a local charity, and that included licking feet in front of shocked school community. I mean, what sick, crazy adults thought that was a good idea? Any parent, teacher or administrator who oversaw that activity needs a visit from the authorities, and quickly. Oklahoma State Superintendent Ryan Walters has promised a thorough investigation. He wrote, "This is disgusting. We are cleaning up this filth in Oklahoma schools. Our agency is investigating." But the lefties claim this is okay because, you know, those students were licking the feet of other students, so nothing to see here. Now, sometimes on Lefties Losing It, the content is so bizarre that one struggles to ascertain if it's real or parody.
You guys spoke and I listened. I'm making all the bathrooms at my concerts not only gender neutral, but species neutral. I will be providing litter boxes in the bathrooms for all animal identifying concert goers on my tour. Now that's inclusivity in action.
I have a terrible feeling that one is real. But we also showcase some real satire on the program, including the work of Aussie comics like Jake Tossell.
I began my day with a welcome to country and smoking ceremony where I burnt some Murdoch media. I then read some pedestrian articles and communist literature. For lunch, I had an almond milk latte and a hit of my vape. I then watched some problematic comedians' videos from 20 years ago to see if I could cancel them for anything. Following that, I called Dad to transfer me money. Getting a job would mean less time to dismantle capitalism and the patriarchy.
And you know what? When it comes to these, some of these attention-seeking parents that we show on Lefties Losing it's clear that they think it's never too early to set your child on the path of gender confusion, medicalised interventions and eventually irreversible surgeries. Here a mother claims her 15-month-old is non-binary and uses they-them pronouns. 15 months.
They are 15 months old. We actually use they-them pronouns. We're great until they tell us who they are. That's why you were like, who, what?
Oh, wow. Okay, so...
They.
They.
Uh-huh.
Awesome. Well, enjoy the Pride Parade.
Did you say thank you? Thank you.
But don't lose faith, because though the lefties do dominate on social media, particularly TikTok and Instagram, there are still normal folk, normal parents who know just how insane and harmful this ideology is.
A part of our 6-year-old son. He just came out as a pirate. He's known since he was 2 months old, but the Children's Hospital have been great. They agreed to pop out an eye, saw off the old hand for the hook, and also one bit of his leg for the peg leg. So it's been really good. His pronouns are P and Ira, and you will respect him.
Right.
So that's what we do every night, 11 p.m.
Good. I never miss it. Why are you telling me?
No, I don't know.
And why are you telling Outsiders audience? We all watch it every night at 11 p.m. Rita. Any sane person would. Thank you. Fantastic. Great ad there. Great ad there. Excellent. You should be an advertiser. I thought I was the advertising guy. Now, let's go now to the war in Israel. Why does the West continually capitulate to Hamas? We talked earlier about the Teals calling for refunding of UNRWA. We've seen calls for Israel to be measured in its response. Penny Wong, all this, moral equivalence stuff, calls for ceasefires endlessly. The left's ridiculous pro-Palestinian posturing. It seems the West is determined to hand victory to Hamas. So, joining us to discuss the absurdity of all this and much more is our dear friend Richard Kemp, former British military commander. He's taught the IDF much of what they know, so he's the man to tell outsiders what is going on. Is the West, Richard, handing victory to Hamas?
Well, I never disagree with you, Rowan, but on this occasion I'll say I haven't taught the IDF much of what they know. They don't need me as a teacher, although I do everything I can to possibly be of assistance. But yeah, I mean, the situation now is that the United States, which is obviously the most important player outside Israel in this particular conflict, and other Israeli allies like the UK and Australia as well, they're pressing Israel for what's called a humanitarian pause or ceasefire to try and get release of the hostages, which is probably a good thing, as long as Hamas can be forced to comply with whatever terms are agreed, as long as it doesn't lead to a long-term cessation of hostilities. And that, I think, is what President Biden wants. He wants this war to end, and end now, before Israel's achieved its objectives. He wants to end the war, and he wants to hand a reward to Hamas and to their supporters in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, to hand them a kind of basically a prize for their assault on Israel on the 7th of October by making a Palestinian state. That's the words that Biden's been using. And his priority here seems to me to be not to allow his ally to secure victory over a ruthless genocidal terrorist mob. He wants to have a foreign policy victory himself in advance of the elections in November, and that he sees as being ending the war on Hamas's terms and creating a Palestinian so-called state. And of course, he needs a foreign policy victory desperately because he's failed in pretty much every other of his foreign policies, like yes. in Afghanistan, in Ukraine. Ukraine is going to the dogs largely because of a lack of American support. So he needs something else. He recognises he sees that potentially as being a defeat for Israel.
James.
But under the doctrines of Islamic warfighting, a treaty, a Hudna treaty, is what's called. If Hamas is allowed to remain in power at all, they will simply use that treaty as a chance to rearm, won't they? And as long as the Biden administration is supporting the renormalization of the mullahs in Iran and empowering them and freeing up their bank accounts and letting them sell oil and everything like that, we are only going to wind up seeing this happen again and again and again, won't we?
Yeah, absolutely right. And there is no, in my view, there is no justification whatsoever of anything other than the complete defeat of Hamas in Gaza. It must happen, and Israel must be supported by its allies to bring that about. And it's not just the West that should be wanting that. It's also Middle Eastern countries, Arab countries like Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, whatever they might say in public, they really want Israel to smash Hamas. Hamas is a threat to their countries. Its jihadist doctrine is a threat to their countries. They want to see a strong Israel. And you can apply, as you said, you brought Iran in. Iran's hands is behind so much of this. Iran is being appeased. There's US still pushing, maybe not quite so strongly now, for some kind of a deal with Iran. And of course, its major proxy up in Lebanon, Hezbollah, which also there's pressure towards some kind of a treaty or agreement with Hezbollah to move north up to the Litani River or towards the Litani River. All of that is, as you rightly said in the start of your point, is that none of these treaties, none of these agreements can possibly be considered to be agreements that will be honoured by any of these organizations. They will do exactly as they like. They will say one thing, they'll do another. They will only act in their own interest or what they perceive to be their own interest. They will not honour any agreement or treaty.
Rita.
And there's reports that Iran's given the green light for Hezbollah to launch large-scale attacks on Israel. But I want to ask you about the anti-Semitism we're seeing, particularly in the UK. Jews say they don't feel safe going out in London on weekends where there are these mass rallies. And we've now got a former Attorney General, Sir Michael Ellis, saying that the BBC is adding to that climate. He says the BBC is institutionally anti-Semitic, and its reporting on the Hamas war has led to some of this ill feeling and hostility and sometimes attacks against British Jews. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it's a very fair assessment. And, you know, the BBC is notoriously biased against Israel and has been for many, many years now. All of their reporting on Israel is very heavily slanted. And in fact, in 2021, the Simon Wiesenthal Center in the United States, which predominantly deals with Holocaust-related issues and anti-Semitism, they publish an annual list of the most anti-Semitic organizations in the world. And in 2021, the BBC came in number 3 on their list of anti-Semitic organizations, just behind. Number 1 was Iran, number 2 was Hamas, number 3 was the BBC. So this is not something that's... I'm not jesting, and this is... you can find all this online, and it's something that's been going on for a very, very long time. And I think, you know, what's not clear is whether or not the staff of the BBC actually believe what they pump out in their anti-Israel propaganda, or whether they just want to do it to suit their own agendas. And of course, their agenda is not just anti-Israel; it's anti-the West, it's anti-British values, exactly. And it's very much in favour of the extreme left, where there is, of course, an intersectionality with anti-Israelism. But it's not just the BBC. There are many other media organisations in the UK, particularly broadcast media, which are also heavily slanted against Israel, and indeed against the West. And they do have, in my view, they do have blood on their hands, because, and it's not just them either, it's not just media, it's the organisations like the UN, it's international organisations like the EU, it's so-called human rights organisations, which play into Hamas's hands. Hamas want Israel to be condemned for killing Gazan civilians, and therefore Hamas constructs their military operations in a way that will maximize the number of deaths among their own civilian populations. Israel tries very hard and succeeds in reducing civilian deaths. But, of course, inevitably in the situation, the way that Hamas fights, some are inevitable, and a large number have happened, unfortunately. And when people condemn Israel for fighting within the laws of armed conflict and for inadvertently incurring civilian deaths, they play right into Hamas's hands and encourage them more and more. And that, of course, translates into the kind of anti-Semitic hatred on the streets of Britain, Australia, the United States and other countries.
And just very quickly, Richard, before we go, how much is Islamist ideology crippling, I would argue, British democracy? We saw the scenes in the Commons last week. We've seen this George Galloway character elected on the weekend, some pretty vile attitudes that he's been accused of in the past. And we had poor old Suella Braverman, who pointed out that Islamist activists were, thwarting British democracy, and she got punted. So how much is there a real risk that now, the way the demographics are going, that British democracy is under threat from extreme Islamism?
I think it's been under threat from extreme Islamism for many years. It was under threat from this same ideology when I was working in the British Cabinet Office back in 2022 and beyond that. And it's, we're seeing politics. The current situation, which is maybe beginning to be recognised because it's been intensified by the Gaza conflict, forced the Prime Minister out onto the streets in front of number 10 Downing Street last night to deliver a message of concern about it. But it's not enough. He may be concerned. He was not specific about what he's going to do about it. He recognised that Jews in Britain are under threat. He recognised that British democracy is under threat from Islamist activism. But he didn't specify how he's going to deal with it. And my view is he will not deal with it. Hand-wringing is one thing, action is another thing. And I'm not really expecting, unfortunately, any action from Rishi Sunak. I'm expecting the situation to deteriorate until Labour gets into power, when it will get much, much worse.
Well, on that cheerful note, Richard Kemp, thanks so much for chatting to us. We'll be chatting a lot more over the coming months. Let's get Suella Braverman into Downing Street. If you could organise that before the next show, we'd greatly appreciate that. Richard Kemp, thank you so much. Coming up, Net Zany, Wackademia, Lefty Lunacy, you name it. It's all happening here on Outsiders. You're watching Outsiders, and it's time for the Net Zany, the crazy wacko world of net zero policies, what they are doing to us. You are watching Outsiders. Thank you for watching us every Sunday morning. We certainly do appreciate it. Well, let's kick off. As Chris Bowen keeps on insisting we're going to have electric utes, yeah, right, we're going to have electric cars left, right and centre. He clearly can't read, or he doesn't have someone doing his media for him, because all around the world, car companies and everybody else is abandoning electric vehicles. But no, Chris Bowen's charging us, let's go straight into electric vehicles. Apple, James, has scrapped its EV plan after a decade.
So they've spent God knows how much money they've tried to create an Apple electric car, which I suppose would be like, an Apple iPhone that just sort of suddenly, when you hit 30% charge, just runs out of gas completely. You can only imagine how much fun that would be, having to stop and restart the whole thing again on the highway because, it's suddenly gotten stuck. No, they're not doing it anymore. So they've said, no, we're just going to tear up all that money. So that's all done. Also, interestingly, too, we've had another backflip on the EVs this week because Audi.
Yep. Last week it was Mercedes.
And we've seen Toyota was one of the first on this to say, no, we're actually going to keep on building internal combustion engines. And this whole plan that they were going to phase out all of their petrol cars, all their diesels by 2026. That's not happening. So Chris Bowen needs to go and, as you say, Rowan, read the room, read the papers, baby, and see what's going on around the world. The idea that somehow Australia, that we're all going to go all electric when the rest of the world has decided, no, we're actually going to have a mix. Let the market, let consumers decide, which is not part of the Chris Bowen plan, because they want to force or nudge you into buying what you don't want, well, sorry, it's not happening.
Rita?
And I was speaking to someone who works in the car industry, an expert in this area, and they said there's an EV battery cliff coming where the EVs that were originally purchased, they're coming out of warranty. And these cars, in this person's opinion, are pretty much worthless because once you don't have that warranty, if you need to replace that battery, the batteries, depending on the model, can cost $30,000, $40,000. I think in the best case scenarios for some of the cheaper options, it might be $14,000. So a significant cost. And who's going to take that risk on to buy a second-hand EV? So again, they haven't thought ahead about what this means because
you know what this is, Rita? This is like all communists. And let's face it, Albo was a communist or empathised or sympathised with communists in his youth. Communists believe if they just keep regulating it and regulating it and regulating it, they ignore reality, they ignore the market, what's going on. Oh, let's put in more rules, more subsidies, the taxpayer will pay this, that and that. They think they can defy reality and make something happen. It's not going to happen. The market has already clearly showed EVs ain't going to happen. So we're pushing uphill. We're at the what Paul Keating described as the rear end of the world, and we're thinking that what's happening in the rest of the world isn't going to hugely impact us, James. The world has moved on from this stuff, and we're still flogging this particular horse. This is why Dutton's going to win the next election, because these clowns can't actually realise what they are pushing Australia into, the madness of this net zenus, as we said. Yes, Rita?
One thing we should point out, the Liberals' current policy right now
still net zero.
They've got to abandon net zero.
So
go nuclear, abandon net zero. That's the way to go. Yeah. Coming up in a second, we chat to Pauline Hanson in a tick. Hello, you're watching Outsiders with Rita Retrovirus Panahi, James Jab number 17, Morrow, and myself, Rowan Dean.
Yeah.
3 words uttered by Queensland Supreme Court Judge Glenn Martin should echo like a gunshot around the world. Vaccine, mandates, unlawful. In my humble opinion, that is all you need to know about the disgraceful, tyrannical, totalitarian, medical, bureaucratic regime that introduced what was, in my opinion, nothing short of a reign of terror over this nation and other Western nations between 2020 and 2023. A reign of terror driven by a relentless campaign of quasi-scientific fear-mongering, deliberately ramped up by governments around the globe in cahoots with each other and with major pharmaceutical corporations that saw families ripped apart, lives and livelihoods destroyed, communities decimated, businesses destroyed, and many lives needlessly lost. As with climate change, it was the COVID policies that did the major economic and social harm, not the virus itself. Basic human rights were trashed and trampled over, sometimes quite literally by thuggish police forces. Dissent was strangled, and the most outrageous censorship was imposed, unlike anything the West has endured in peacetime. Whilst obscene profits were made by certain companies and equally obscene rewards handed out in more recent times in the form of cushy jobs and lavish lifestyles to many of those politicians and bureaucrats who inflicted this dystopian nightmare upon us. Virtually alone in the Australian media, I was vehemently opposed to vaccine mandates from before the vaccines were even available. The cost of my opposition to every aspect of this COVID tyranny saw me branded an anti-vaxxer, a conspiracy theorist, and, along with Rita, defamed by the Greens and others in the Australian Senate. The magazine, of which I'm the editor-in-chief, The Spectator Australia, was the only mainstream media outlet in this nation and on many occasions throughout the English-speaking world that was opposed to every aspect of the COVID dictatorship and spoke out against it every single week without failure. As for the rest of the mainstream media, did they do what the media is supposed to do? Did they question the regulations? Did they demand proof that the risk of not being vaccinated outweighed the risk of COVID? Did they ask the tough questions about the human rights implications of mandatory vaccinations? Did they empathise and sympathise with those Australians who chose not to get vaccinated? Don't make me laugh. They couldn't hop on the COVID bandwagon fast enough.
This is our shot to look out for each other.
To keep businesses open.
To keep people in jobs.
To keep healthy and safe.
This is our shot to say goodbye to quarantine.
And to bring Australians home.
Our shot to get everyone together for Christmas.
To end lockdowns once and for all.
This is our shot.
Our shot.
Our shot. This is our shot.
I've had my shot.
This is my shot.
This is my shot.
This is my shot. Come on, Australia, let's get the job done. Start a conversation with your doctor about your shot.
That's just a teensy-weensy taste of how you were abandoned and let down by the institutions who are supposed to protect your individual rights, including, of course, the Australian Human Rights Commission, who were completely silent during COVID. And yet, here it is in black and white from the Queensland Supreme Court. Quote, in Brisbane on Tuesday, Justice Glenn Martin ruled that the Queensland Police Service and Queensland Ambulance Service policies breached part of the Human Rights Act. End of quote. Now, the judge's findings may well be appealed in the High Court, who knows? And the ruling was very specific in making a technical ruling against certain directions that applied to certain individuals in certain jobs. Sure. But the thing is, human rights are universal. In fact, all human rights laws around the world derive from the one foundational document actually called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in December 1948, chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt. There she is, holding it, in the aftermath of the totalitarian horrors of the Second World War. The key point is human rights are universal. I'm not a lawyer, but if Australia's vaccine mandates are ruled to have breached the human rights of one group of Australians, by definition and by logic, they breached every Australian's human rights. Just take a look at this picture. Just a tiny taste of the insanity of what Australians endured under COVID lockdown tyranny and vaccine mandates. An Aussie Sheila on a U-Butte Bonza beach being frog-marched off by goons clad in the most absurd attire pretty much sums up the craziness of COVID for me. Pure Monty Python farce. Here on Outsiders, we have played you many times our compilation of the horrors of Dan Andrews' police brutality. And you'll see it many more times, don't worry, until those responsible for these disgusting abuses of Victorians' basic human rights are held to account or formally apologise. Yet all the major institutions supposed to act as checks and balances in a democracy to protect your rights, all of them, the Human Rights Commission, the medical fraternity, the media, the parliaments, the legal fraternity, almost to a man and a woman, they went along with this COVID tyranny. Other than myself, there were only a handful of other politicians, doctors, commentators, journalists, and some very brave individuals prepared to challenge the madness. I'm proud to say that when I had my evening show here on Sky, The World According to Rowan Dean, I made a point of inviting every week onto the show someone who had lost their job or sacrificed their career because they refused to comply with vaccine mandates. Everyone from doctors and nurses to police, ambos, airline pilots, fireys, a Woolworths shelf stacker. Vaccine mandates that have now been ruled by one Supreme Court judge as a breach of human rights, as unlawful. Have the governments and bureaucrats and corporations apologised? Some still aren't even allowed back to work. What a disgrace. According to the Australian newspaper, many legal experts are already saying the Queensland Supreme Court ruling is just the tip of the iceberg of litigation that could now follow to overturn mandates and seek compensation. I have been saying for yonks now that we need a royal commission into the abuse of power during COVID. Justice Glenn Martin has now put a crack in that damn wall and it will hopefully burst open. I repeat, the vaccine mandates were unlawful because they breached, according to the Queensland Supreme Court, certain workers' human rights. One former Chief Health Officer, Nick Coatsworth, has already come forward to admit he got it wrong on the mandates, and I applaud him for doing so.
Those who choose not to get vaccinated need to there needs to be some sort of incentive stick, perhaps, through the current programs, including No Jab, No Pay, to make that happen.
The mandates, yes, I think we did get that wrong, and I think you can say hindsight is 20/20, but Carl, hindsight gives us foresight, and if we have another pandemic, we should think long and hard whether mandates for vaccines are justified.
The pathway is now there for mass class actions, and I urge you to pursue such a course if you too were a victim, lost your job, stood down, and possibly even prosecutions of those in authority if they are shown to have abused their power. Funny how so many of the COVID-era political and bureaucratic head-honchos have now moved on to other jobs. One such former Chief Health Officer is Jeanette Young, now the Queensland Governor-General. Remember her? Well, this was the direction given by Dr Young on 12 May 2021. Quote, "A relevant employee must, to continue working, have received one dose of either Pfizer or AstraZeneca by 31st March and have received a second dose of Pfizer on or around 21st of April or a second dose of AstraZeneca on or around 23rd June. And on it went, other stuff. But the questions that now needs to be asked, in the context of the Queensland Supreme Court decision, did Chief Health Officer Dr Young properly make the decision to impose the vaccine on Queensland government employees? Will the Government of Queensland release the documentation surrounding that decision? And are there aspects of the Supreme Court decision on vaccine mandates that bring into question other decisions by Dr Young, such as directing that lone individuals in their private motor vehicles needed to wear masks, that banning a 4-plane flyover over the Gold Coast on Anzac Day by pilots in their own aircraft, and all that sort of stuff? And that's just one. She's just one of many individuals with serious, similar questions to answer. Let me point out, it wasn't only the Chief Health Officers who got it wrong, so too did the so-called fact-checkers. Here's a classic example from Queensland Liberal Senator Gerard Rennick, who all the way back in 2021, yes, claimed that there were human rights laws to protect Australians from mandatory vaccination, which we now know to be true, but which the AAP fact-checkers claimed were false. Quote, what was claimed by Gerard, COVID-19 vaccination mandates are at odds with the 1986 Human Rights Commission Act, end of quote. The AAP fact-checkers verdict, that's at the bottom of your screen, false. Experts say the legislation in question does not have any relevance to vaccine mandates in Australia. They were wrong. The experts were wrong. The fact-checkers were wrong. The medical bureaucrats, the politicians, the authorities got it wrong. Here's just a tiny sample of COVID clowns and cock-ups.
We're looking at the seating at the moment, and of course we're looking at the ball, because sometimes the ball, not that I've been to many football games, I have noticed occasionally it does get kicked into the crowd, and we are working through the details of what that will mean. If you are at Adelaide Oval and the ball comes towards you, my advice to you is to duck and just do not touch that ball.
We will be looking at what contact tracing looks like in the New World Order.
What is the medical advice supporting the continual closure of gyms in Melbourne?
Gyms are a high-risk environment. I understand, again, the pain for those gym owners.
All right, Tony Doherty, so you can go to a brothel in country Victoria, but you can't lift a barbell in Melbourne. Is Brett Sutton telling the truth?
Look, Brett Sutton is not telling the truth, Peter. It would seem that he makes it up as he goes along.
And ultimately, it became very obvious
that this was now a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
I'll give you an age breakdown, which I know is always of interest. And it just confirms that this really is a pandemic now of the unvaccinated.
This is, I've said a couple of times, really a pandemic and epidemic of the unvaccinated.
At a breakfast meeting between close neighbours came a message from a friend much further away.
Vaccinating as many people as possible, as quickly as possible.
But the Prime Minister is troubled by problems at home.
We've met at a time when so many Australians are now subject to lockdowns.
And leaders agree vaccinations are the way out.
This is an epidemic or a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
Except it wasn't. I could show you plenty more. A fear campaign frequently based on incorrect information, evidence that led to the appalling demonisation of a huge swathe of the Australian public. And that's before we even start to question the safety of the vaccines themselves. This week, every bit as significant as the Queensland Supreme Court ruling about the mandates, two other things happened. In the UK Telegraph reports that the UK medicines regulator failed to flag COVID vaccine side effects and must be investigated, according to a group of MPs. Excellent stuff. More importantly, here in Australia, the United Australia Party Senator Ralph Babet got a motion passed by the Australian Senate acknowledging the need to investigate the excess deaths, which some people suspect may be related to the vaccines themselves, the excess mortality figures of 2021, 22 and 23 officially recorded by the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, in this country. Senator Babet got this motion over the line with the help of One Nation, with the help of the Coalition, and my congratulations to him, with the help of the ACT's Senator David Pocock. And what does the motion say? Here's Ralph.
That the Senate acknowledges that the concerning number of excess deaths observed in Australia in 2021 and 2022 has continued into 2023 as evidenced by all-cause provisional mortality from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and that there is a need for further inquiry as to the reasons for these excess deaths.
So well done, Ralph, and those who supported him. It's a great win. But here's the truly scary thing, and I mean scary. We learnt during COVID that governments can't be trusted to protect your human rights. The media can't be trusted to do their job and be sceptical about the so-called experts, and that those authorities and bureaucrats are, well, I'm sorry, often buffoons. Despite all of that, this Labor government is about to pass its Combating Misinformation and Disinformation Bill, which means that in future years, people such as myself, or Rita, or anybody else, or the Spectator Australia, who are sceptical about aspects of government policy, may have no way of voicing that scepticism online, given the massive penalties or fines potentially applicable to online service providers. And equally, this is just absurd. The government could say whatever they want with impunity. That Orwellian bill is currently working its way through our parliament now, and it must be stopped. Secondly, and even more terrifying, this really is terrifying, the World Health Organization, the WHO, the WHO's Global Pandemic Treaty. Now, I've been warning about this for years, both here on Outsiders and in The Spectator Australia. But have a listen to Wayne Thring from the African Christian Party only a couple of days ago in the South African Parliament.
I wish to make it abundantly clear that the World Health Organization's two instruments, the proposed pandemic agreement and amendments to the international health regulations, are nothing short of an autocratic dictatorial move towards a one-world government seeking to erode the sovereignty of independent nations. The ACDP believes that the proposed pandemic treaty, read with the amendments to the international health regulations, will set humanity into a new era that is strangely organised around pandemics. In the UK Parliament, the Honourable Philip Davies warned that we are talking about a top-down approach to global public health hardwired into international law. At the top of that top-down approach, we have our single source of truth on all things pandemic, the World Health Organization's Director General.
Couldn't have put it better myself. This World Health Organization's proposed pandemic agreement and the amendments to the international health regulations must be opposed at all costs. Australia must have no part in this. This agreement and amendments condemn us to a terrifying future in which the errors and abuses of COVID will look like a walk in the park. This park on your screen in particular. A judge has spoken. The vaccine mandates were unlawful. Such madness must never be allowed to occur again. And it's up to every one of us to ensure that it never does. Well, joining us now to talk about the Queensland Supreme Court's ruling that the directions given regarding vaccine mandates were unlawful in that they breached workers' human rights is Senator Pauline Hanson, leader of the One Nation Party. Pauline, great to see you. Now, this was a big, big win. I mean, you were one of the politicians I referred to earlier in my editorial who, throughout COVID, spoke up against the madness of lockdowns, vaccine mandates, masks, school closures, all the other garbage that went along with it. And congratulations to you. This is very much a victory for you and others, particularly it being in Queensland. So what are the lessons we learnt from the Supreme Court this week?
That we definitely have to have a Royal Commission into this, Rowan. It's imperative now that we do go forward with it. The way that the bureaucrats, the politicians, the premiers, even our Prime Minister, the way they conducted themselves through this, took away the people's human rights, is clearly now defined in the unlawful. As they said, the Supreme Court said it was unlawful, that we need a Royal Commission into this. We cannot not allow this to happen again. Right from the very beginning, I opposed it vehemently, and actually to the point whereas I withheld my vote on the floor of Parliament from the coalition on many issues until they dealt with this. I was also supported by Senators Gerard Rennick, Malcolm Roberts and also Alex Antic. We are very strongly of the opinion. And in the High Court ruling, as you've done a great summary of it, there was two instances here. With the ambulance service workers, it was based on contract and law. They didn't have the health mandates under contract and law, and the other one was to do with human rights. See, in Queensland, we do have the state human rights legislation, as does Victoria and this ACT. So they were able to base it on that. And see, under the human rights, you can't impose people to have medical procedures or anything unless they're with their free and full and informed consent, which they didn't. So that's why the ruling came down as it is. So it may not be the same in other states, because I know there is other challenges in the other states in Western Australia. So how that's determined will be quite interesting.
Rita.
I'm interested in a different issue, something I know you care about, and this is renaming well-known islands, national parks. We've had Fraser Island renamed. We've Magnetic Island National Park there's a plan to rename that. I know the locals there are worried that means the entire island's going to be renamed after that. And now we've also got Great Keppel Island. Tell me about the plan to, again, change a well-known name that's recognised. It's a tourist hotspot. Tell me what this plan is to give it a new name.
Well, they want to rename it Whopper. Can you imagine it? People would know. They say, "Oh, are you going to Whopper?" Well, they'll probably think you're going to McDonald's to get a great Whopper. So it is absolutely ridiculous. I'm opposed to this. If we actually get the balance of power after the next state election, we're going to put a stop to all this. We will not support any form of treaties throughout Queensland, and the name changes. There was even talk years ago about changing the name on the Gold Coast Burleigh Heads to an Aboriginal name. Why do we do this for such a small minority of our population, 3% supposedly, if that is Aboriginal? Why are we changing the names that we've had for a couple of 100 years? Rita, I'm absolutely fed up with this. We're virtue signalling here. We're actually chasing our tails. And instead of dealing with the real issues that concerns the people of Australia, is bring down costs of living, electricity costs, increase to our rates, state levies, regulations, all this other rubbish. That's what people want us to deal with, not changing names.
James.
And I want to ask about another issue too for the next election. We're looking at another federal election, end of this year, possibly next year, early next year. Big news out of One Nation. You've brought Craig Kelly in from the UAP to run your federal national campaign. We talked about this a bit earlier in the week, but what does this mean? And is this going to mean that all of the kind of smaller, minor parties are going to coalesce underneath the One Nation banner? Or is that what the aim is here to do with this move?
It basically is, Clive is not registered any longer. And when we're speaking of Clive, I just want to put out a big thank you to Clive Palmer for funding the case in Queensland to do with the Supreme Court and the COVID. So big thank you to him. With regard to that, Clive Palmer deregistered the party federally. So although he's got Senator Babette there, who I respect his hard work, he is a great representative in the floor of Parliament. So now, people have kept saying, why can't all of you Conservatives get together and work together? I've been trying to do that for quite some time, but it hasn't happened. Now with bringing Craig Kelly into the fold of One Nation to work for us and to go around and speak to people, I think it's a big plus that people will come on board that Conservative side. You see, Dunkley, because we didn't stand in Dunkley either, did Clive Palmer. So that was 8% of the Conservative vote that basically some went back to the Labor Party, because a lot of Labor Party will vote for us that won't vote for Libs. And the fact is that that vote was then split. So we do have an impact on the voters in Australia. Those people who want the Conservative side of politics, and they see the moderates infiltrating the Liberal Party, and they are so angry about it. People want family values. They want their kids not to talk this bloody rubbish, this gender dysphoria rubbish that's going on at the moment. So there's a lot of real Conservative values that we stand for. Let's stop the high immigration, let's get the housing, look after your businesses, get rid of this net zero, because that's my policy. I will not support net zero of any form. Let's get, so let's get back to the real policies, and I think that's what people want, is strong leadership and good policies and have a vision for the future.
Rita?
Well, I was going to ask you about Dunkley. How do you see the result there, and did you make a strategic decision not to run a candidate there?
Yes, we did. We didn't want to stand in Dunkley. We knew that we would not have a chance of winning the seat, but the battle has to be, and people have to understand the battle's got to be between the Liberal and Labor, with us, throwing in anything there. If you look at the vote that both of us with UAP and One Nation was 8%, maybe if we had stood, it might have swung to the Libs. So this might be a big lesson for the Libs. At the next election, don't put the Greens and Labor ahead of One Nation, which they did in the last election. So the Libs have got a lot to answer for in how they treated One Nation last election, when most of the time, I support coalition policies and legislation. I'm not their enemy. The enemy in this country is mainly the Greens, and the Labor takes up Greens policies. But the people aren't informed enough about where this country is going. Rowan mentioned about the misinformation, disinformation bill. That will have such an impact on our freedom of speech and the right information, critical thinking getting out in our country, even from politicians and political parties. What they're doing in the environment, where they're shutting down industries, manufacturing, where the electricity prices, this renewable energy. It's going to have such an impact on our cost of living, which it is, but even more so. And that's why it's imperative that we get it right with policies. And the Libs, and another thing about Victoria, there's been no presence of the Liberal Party in Victoria for quite some time. Weak leadership, they've gone woke. That's why the media are always on the side of the Labor. So they've got to get their message out, what they stand for, what they intend to do. This is what people want. But I think it's a real lesson. Albanese is not as safe as what he thinks he is. The turn is on against Labor because they can't stand his lies. He goes back on his word, and he's not a true leader for this nation.
Pauline Hanson, fantastic always to chat to you and to have you here on Outsiders this morning. Thank you so much. Coming up, we've got James's donkey vote. Lots more happening here on Outsiders. Don't go away. Back in a tick.
Hello, you're watching Outsiders with Rita, Passport Please Panahi, and Rowan, Run for the Border Dean, and myself, your favorite migrant, James Morrow, who brings you all the news about U.S. politics every Friday night on this station.
What time?
At 8 p.m., Rita.
What time did you say?
8 p.m. for the U.S. Report every Friday night. Now, in a moment, I'm going to bring you the latest from the southern border crisis in the U.S., but first, let's check in with Joe Biden and see how the president is planning to help Palestinians trapped in Gaza because the Hamas terrorist group refuses to surrender.
In the coming days, we're going to join with our friends in Jordan and others in providing airdrops of additional food and supplies into Ukraine.
Into Ukraine? Hey, Mildred, he's making up countries again. God, anyway, at least he didn't call it Mexico like that time when he was trying to prove how mentally fit and with it he was, and then called it Mexico. You almost had to feel sorry here then for White House spokesman John Kirby, who had to do another cleanup on Aisle Joe.
When the president said we were airdropping to Ukraine twice, he meant Gaza, correct? He just misspoke.
He was referring to Gaza.
Yeah, he was referring to Gaza. Now America was shocked this week in more serious news by the murder of Laken Riley, a 22-year-old nursing student who was out for a run one morning in Athens, Georgia, and was murdered allegedly by an illegal immigrant called Jose Ibarra from Venezuela, who it turns out was already had multiple run-ins with the law, but had been allowed to keep walking free again and again in Joe Biden's America, a place where foreign criminals seem to just walk free, while, of course, other people, let's say journalists who are charged with a misdemeanor because the government didn't like the way they covered the January 6th incident at the U.S. Capitol, wind up facing possible jail over misdemeanors. And as much of a tragedy as this Laken Riley murder is for the family and friends of the young student who were forced to late arrest a young woman taken far too soon in an entirely unnecessary crime, this is also a big disaster politically for the Biden administration, which is now absolutely under the pump for its virtually open border policies that have run basically since they took office. Now, naturally, the media in the U.S. has been running a cover operation for the Bidens. The Associated Press tried to claim that this was really actually not a story about migration, but the danger female athletes face when they go running alone, and refused for a time to even mention that Laken Riley's alleged killer was in the country illegally. Meanwhile, CNN did its own thing, claiming that there was little evidence to link illegal immigration with crime. Sure, okay. Just ask Laken Riley's family. Meanwhile, the White House is doing its best to spin its way out of trouble on the issue. Here's Karine Jean-Pierre asked about just what the Biden administration is going to do to crack down on illegal immigration, which has exploded from under 500,000 a year when Donald Trump was trying to build his wall to more than 3 million a year. Have a listen.
The president took 94 or so executive actions in his first 100 days that largely loosened immigration policy. One of those was narrowing who ICE could remove. And the administration, as of yesterday, I believe, is now calling on sanctuary cities to cooperate with ICE. So why doesn't the president act like he said it's time to do and start undoing some of those policies that he put in place right when he got into office?
So I think a couple of things. Since day one, the president took action. He did. He put forth a comprehensive immigration policy, and he did that because he understood what was happening, right? He understood that the immigration system was broken. He understood that we needed to take action, and he did.
Oh, really? Did he now? You know, it's a shame that the Washington Post and Facebook and CNN and all those people don't do real fact checks against this White House like they do when Republicans are in power. I mean, let's look at what actually Biden was saying back in 2020.
How exactly would you detain immigrants, if at all, in a Biden administration?
The way we did when we reformed the system with the DACA, I would not retain them behind bars. They show up. No, here's what they do. They show up. Sometimes you have an ankle bracelet, you set a hearing. Nobody, and some of you are going to get mad at me with this, but nobody is going to be deported in my first 100 days until we get through the point that we find out the only rationale for deportation will be whether or not you've committed a felony while in the country. On day one, I'm going to send immigration legislation reform to the Congress to provide a roadmap to citizenship for 11 million undocumented immigrants and so much that make up so much of our communities and make us so strong.
Now, all of this has, of course, created a great political opportunity for Donald Trump, who paid a visit to the border Friday and got quite the welcome.
They like Trump. Can you believe it?
They like Trump. What can I say? I tell you what, I can say November cannot come soon enough.
Well, this weekend, of course, Mardi Gras here in Sydney. That's the LGBTIQ thing. Some strange bedfellows, as it were. We had the Queers for Palestine. I'm not sure they've done their homework, but anyway, Queers for Palestine turned up at last night's Mardi Gras or Friday's rally.
Piece of satire?
Yeah, queer solidarity with Palestinian resistance. James.
Palestinian resistance. So that would suggest is that?
Well, I mean, like there was news reports about Palestinians being killed for being gay in the West Bank overnight. But this, when you talk about Queers for Palestine, you are talking about chickens for KFC. I mean, this is so insane, and it shows absolutely how nuts that sort of radical left fringe of the sexuality movement has become.
So the New South Wales police are harmful and institutionally homophobic.
Hamas, though.
But in the Palestinian territories in Gaza, no, that's just a wonderful place. I mean, the only place where homosexuals have any sort of meaningful rights and equality in the Middle East is in Israel. So if you want to be against the only state in that region that protects members of the LGBT...
And there is horrific video of Palestinian gay men who've been, well, what's happened to them at the hands of Hamas does not bear thinking about. Coming up, lots more, but we've got the Canberra Clown Show in a tick. Don't go away. Roll up, roll up. Yes, step right this way. It's the greatest show on earth. It's the Canberra Clown Show, starring, as always, that master of keeping a straight face, even as he cracks the funniest gags in the Labour caucus. Who can forget his hilarious starring role in 2022 on Channel 10's top comedy show, The Project, as Al Bozo tried to keep a straight face as he brazenly justified breaking Labor's solemn promise to slash your electricity bills by $275. Even Waleed and Carrie could see right through this clown act.
The war in Ukraine had already started by the time you were saying this in the election. So I'm just trying to get what is the current promise? What's the current guarantee? Is it still the old one, or do you have a new one? Or?
The guarantee is that renewables are the cheapest form of energy, that we will fix the transmission of the grid,
but you're not
and that will make a difference.
Guarantee on numbers. That's gone now?
No, what we know, the numbers are the energy bills will be cheaper if you have more renewables in the system and you fix transmission.
I think you can check that fact out by looking at your electricity bill. But the gags kept coming thick and fast this week thanks to the ABC's leading comedy show Q&A, also known as Quacks and Activists. Clearly worried about their never-ending catastrophic plunge in the ratings, Q&A decided to amp up the humour this week with none other than their most popular comedic performer, the man even Donald Trump couldn't take seriously, Mr. Trumbull.
The scary thing is that for countries like Australia and many European countries, we may find ourselves... are we going to find ourselves not dealing just with two autocracies in Russia and China, But what is Trump's America going to look like? This is a guy leading a party that is no longer committed to democracy as we understand it.
Well done, Malcolm. Yes, the great Malcolm Turnbull, who agitated behind the scenes to stab our own popularly elected Prime Minister Tony Abbott in the back and install himself in power instead. How democratic was that? Here's Mr. Trumbull with a straight face accusing Donald Trump of not respecting democracy. Even Patricia Karvelis couldn't buy that line.
I may know that there are questions around Trump, but I have to pick you up on that because that's quite a statement. You think that America is genuinely sliding into becoming a country that's an autocracy that's no longer a democracy?
Well, if by democracy you mean a country that's governed by the rule of law, yeah, for sure. I mean, Donald Trump does not believe the law applies to him. Donald Trump lost the 2020 election and refused to accept it.
Oh, hang on. Refused to accept defeat. That has a certain Trumbull-esque ring to it too. Here's Mr. Trumbull refusing to accept the reality of his own defeat when he spoke to Andrew Neil in London shortly after Turnbull was turfed out of the Big Top by ScoMo. Mr. Trumbull claims, again with a straight face, that the Liberals got rid of him. Wait for it, drum roll. Because they were afraid he would win the 2019 election. Even Andrew Neil, who's interviewed some pretty entertaining clowns in his time, couldn't swallow that line.
You were still the fourth Australian Prime Minister in 8 years to be discarded.
Well,
you're an example of a centrism in retreat.
Well, yeah. I was certainly voted out by my party room, fairly narrowly, but I think that said more about the internal politics of the Liberal Party than of the electorate. I mean, at the time...
Well, they didn't like your centrism.
Well, at the time of the coup in August, we were level pegging on the public polls with the opposition, and we were 4 points ahead on the polling in the marginal seats. But basically, you could argue that their concern was not that I would lose the election, but rather that I would win it.
You're telling me your own party didn't want you to win the next election?
Well, I'm just saying, if you analyse...
That's not credible, is it?
Well,
No, that's not credible. Speaking of clown shows, this week, Senator Malcolm Roberts from One Nation attempted to get some clarity from the Australian energy regulators, good luck with that, about claims that Queenslanders were having their air conditioning and solar panel units turned off by the Queensland government. After tripping all over themselves, the energy clowns left us, as you might expect, completely in the dark.
A lot of people in Queensland were shocked when the government reached into their homes and controlled their air conditioning units 170,000 times in the last 2 months. Now we're finding out the government can turn off their solar panels as well.
So I'll just look at my colleague, Ms Jolly, or to Mr Duggan to see if they...
Yeah, I was going to ask Senator if you'd give us a sense of where those figures came from, because I hadn't heard them before. I think, Senator, that would be a question that I suspect, and here, I think, having access to the information that you've got, I think, would help us out enormously.
Doesn't the Australian Energy Regulator oversee the whole lot?
We oversee it, but not in necessarily the way in which the system is operated, and that's a system operation question. We make sure people comply with the rules.
You may not be able to answer this question, but you're the overseer. How many air conditioners have been installed with remote demand management systems under the Peak Smart program in Queensland?
I wouldn't have access to that data, Senator.
Are you able to get it on notice?
I don't think we would have that as an agency. That sounds like a Queensland government program.
But you're overseeing the national?
Well, we oversee the bits that are within the national electricity law and rules. State-based programs are usually done through state-based legislation.
But my question is whether there is actually anything in the electricity rules that will stop an electricity company if they decide to try to force someone to take a smart meter, make it mandatory.
I think I'll need to take that on notice as well, Senator.
This notion of the national energy grid and then the role of the states, I think probably what we're tripping over here is that situation.
What a complete schmozzle, and it only got worse. And finally, I had to laugh at this one. Here's the brilliant South Australian Senator Alex Antic talking about the hilarious failings of the woke Canberra circus in the Burley Griffin Big Top, no less.
From Bundaberg to Townsville, this building is meant to be the most representative building in the land. Well, why then does walking around this building feel quite like it could possibly be the least representative building in this land? Well, the reason is that this building at the moment is populated by the hard left. Whether it's a woke politician, someone who works for a woke politician, a woke lobbyist speaking to woke politicians, or a woke journalist writing favourable stories about woke politicians, in 2024 this building now has about as much in common with a real Australia as ABC headquarters at Ultimo. And the truth is, this has happened because we've let it happen. If you ever want to answer the question of how this country has gone so far off the rails in the last 2 years, come to Canberra, walk around this building and see for yourself, or do yourself a disservice and listen to 5 minutes of some of the nonsense coming out of this chamber. And by the way, just like Chuck Norris, that's a 2-minute statement in 60 seconds.
Not to be outdone, Clown Show's favourite slapstick goofball, Murray, who, what, when, where and why do we employ this bloke, managed this week to make a complete goose of himself, not only by making fun of a deadly serious issue, namely why are Labor releasing detainees who support Hamas, as well as trying to make a joke about Sky.
One of the individuals granted a visa and already living in Australia expressed support for the horrific terrorist attack perpetrated by Hamas on October 7. How was it that this person was granted a visa if sufficient checks were supposedly conducted, as you have just said?
We know that all of you beat the door down in order to beat each other into the Sky News studio 10 times a day. And it would hello all of my friends in Sky News. You're obviously now drafting questions for the opposition. A bit of a promotional campaign for Sky News.
What a complete clown. Almost makes you want to weep about who's running this country. What would Smokey Robinson say? Weekly Wokley. Well, you remember a couple of weeks ago we had the Turkish MP who called for God to strike down Israel or something or other in the Turkish parliament. We had it as an instant karma segment. He had a heart attack a few seconds later. Well, one Israeli comedian had a lot of fun with that idea. Have a listen.
In Turkey, in the government, one of the politicians stood up and screamed that Allah is going to kill all the Jews and destroy Israel. As he said that, he drops and has a heart attack. But he doesn't die right away. He died only 2 days later. Why? Because he had the heart attack in Turkey. If he would have had this heart attack in New York City, they'd have brought him to NY Jew Hospital, into the Goldberg Pavilion, up to Silverstein elevators, into the Harwich cardiothoracic unit, put a stent in him, got him out in a half hour. But now, he had the heart attack in Turkey. The best they could do is give him hair plugs.
Fantastic stuff. And here's another. I mean, I hate to say it, the Jewish comedians are the best on the planet. There was none greater than Seinfeld. Here he was this week. Have a listen.
I have noticed that most of the guests are mostly white males. Of 22 episodes that you've had.
Get into that.
No, but you
take a look over here, Peter. What do you see? A lot of whiteys. What's going on here? Oh, this really pisses me off. But go ahead. Really pisses me off. People think it's the census or something. I mean, this has got to represent the actual pie chart of America. Who cares? It's just funny. You know, funny is the world that I live in. You're funny, I'm interested. You're not funny, I'm not interested. Okay. And I have no interest in gender or race or anything like that, but everyone else is kind of with their little calculating, is this the exact right mix? You know, I think that's, to me, it's comedy.
He's so great. Such a great comedian. Rita.
And what he says is so true. Just about every new production you see, it's almost like you can see them ticking the boxes. Do we have a lesbian who might have some sort of a visible disability? Do we have a mixed-race couple? It's like they're just trying to...
Well, somebody had a great line about how that sort of really infected like the advertising industry too in the United States. Yep. And they said that if you were to watch car ads in the United States, you would think every couple is mixed race and loves camping.
But interesting feature, Jerry, just because in recent days he got this crazy vitriol and anti-Semitism. He was emerging from a Jewish event in New York. And they were calling him, saying he was guilty of genocide. I think they even called him a Nazi. The man's a Jewish man. But so though he's disinterested in the politics is interested in him. So it's sometimes these celebrities get red-pilled against their will. They say something that's entirely normal and mainstream, and the hate mobs come for them.
But comedy is the greatest bulwark, the greatest bulwark against this kind of totalitarian
But the important
mindset.
thing, though, about this, though, is that just like somebody like J.K. Rowling, who's really rich and can afford it, Jerry Seinfeld, he can't be cancelled. He's got $1 billion in the bank, So it's really incumbent on people like that who've got money and power and status to keep fighting this, because there's a lot of little guys out there who will get absolutely steamrolled.
And similarly with Ricky Gervais and Dave Chappelle, they're probably the two top comics of the era now. And they're almost too big to cancel. The mobs come for them, but they don't care.
Comedy is the key. Comedy is the key to fighting this totalitarian mindset. Well done to those comedians. James, just quickly, Columbia University, the clown show carries on.
I love this story. So at Columbia University Medical School, so one of the most prestigious medical schools in the country, if not the world, the chief DEI officer, a guy named Alade Ken, he has been accused, quite credibly it sounds like, of plagiarizing his doctoral thesis, including lifting 2 pages directly from Wikipedia on the topic of Afrocentric education. So this is what's happening at one of the most prestigious medical schools in the world. You were talking about the heart attack there before. This is how they're training the doctors. I don't think you get that same treatment anymore.
And some good news from the University of Florida. They've fired all of their DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion employees, saving millions and also saving themselves a lot of hassles they don't need.
And saving themselves all those plagiarism lawsuits. That's it for this week's show. Don't forget, there's 2 shows during the week you must watch. Well, Rita Panahi at 11 p.m. every night, Monday to Thursday. James Morrow, of course, 8 p.m. on the US Report. So much happening there in the States. We'll see you next Sunday here at 9 a.m. on Outsiders.